up this topic of what it means to be involved in ministry in the digital age. And the power of digital communications and social media has been utterly profound. It changes the shape of ministry, it changes the shape of theological education. It changes the way we go about our social and political life. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us to think about that. It's a topic I am very much interested in listening in on. We've got a couple of folks for whom this is really very much at the center of their thinking. We welcome Dr. Mary Hess, who is a professor of educational leadership here. That she has got a long interest in working with questions of education, various pedagogical models. She's regularly engaged in what does digital media look like here? How does that inform our pedagogy? How does that inform the kinds of ministries that we're doing? The power of popular culture. She is our resident expert in terms of doing that. She's been on leave this year, serving in teaching at St. Michael's in Toronto. But we're delighted that she's here for these couple of days here, so she can share some of that. We'll look forward to welcoming her back at the end of this academic year. Pastor Keith Anderson also lives in the digital spaces, an ELCA pastor who is one of those folks on the creative edge of helping us think about how do we work creatively in ministry when so much interaction is taking place not only in the physical spaces within our churches, physical spaces off of our physical campuses of our churches, but also in those digital spaces. And so this is something I very much look forward to hearing about. They're going to engage us in some dialogue around that. We've got some physical space, and we may have a little bit of digital space that gets woven into all of this too. So without further ado, we welcome the two of you to the front. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, good afternoon. We're going to try to keep you awake after lunch here in this darkened space. It's really great to be here. I flew in from Philadelphia yesterday. One of the things we want to be sure to point out, we're encouraging you, if you're on Twitter, to tweet at us throughout the time. The hashtag is LSConvo2017. And at the end, we are going to have time for discussion and question and answer. And if you or somebody out in our digital spaces, our extended audience, want to tweet at us, and we'll take some questions from Twitter as well. And Dawn is monitoring that for us, and we'll keep an eye on it. And we'll check in with her later on. So we should probably talk about how we know each other.
You want to start?
It's become the story of my life that most of the people that I know and collaborate with, I've known in digital spaces much longer than physical spaces. And this is actually the first time that Mary and I have actually been together in person, though we have been in conversation for years in digital spaces with shared colleagues and asking similar questions about what technology means for us in the church and how that shapes ministry and that intersection of church and culture. And as a parish pastor, which I am, and somebody, I'll kind of share more in the workshop, but in my own kind of process of learning about what these digital tools can do and what it means for me as a ministry leader to use them, Mary has been such a great guide along the way in that for me.
Well, and as Keith said, I had encountered him, his ideas, and actually his devotees and disciples for quite a while before this first just meeting you in person. And I really want to do a shout out. He's got 2 books that I use a lot in my classes. The first one he wrote with Elizabeth Drescher. It's called Click to Save, and it's a very lovely how-to book, basically, in terms of thinking about ways in pastoral leadership that you might engage with these digital tools. And I understand there's a new version that's going to come out shortly.
Second edition. Yeah.
Very up to date. And then he's got another lovely book called The Digital Cathedral. And part of how I found Keith in the first place was because I was very interested in how people were working with these things in pastoral ministry. What were people actually doing on the ground as all of these new kinds of tools and things emerged? Because we are pretty much having to experiment to figure it out, right? We're playing with it. And to find an ELCA pastor who not only was playing with it, but doing it in ways that I thought had real substance and a real clear understanding of how the word could become embodied in those spaces was a gift. So now it's fun that Luther has brought us together in person. So, as we were thinking about this and in conversation, it's kind of hard to avoid thinking about the Reformation right now because it's the celebration and everything else, but I'm a Roman Catholic, and so thinking about the Reformation is a little bit different from my perspective. And one of the things that because I spend a lot of time reading in media studies and thinking about the ways in which how our media practices shift how we make sense of the world, the Reformation, of course, was a moment in history when a new medium, i.e. the printing press, emerged. And the printing press, of course, had an enormous impact on how people made sense of themselves in the world, because now, as Luther made accessible to people, they had access to biblical texts in their own languages. They had access to these ideas that were not just being held by a very small group of people. They were actually something that people could engage with. And I think that we're in the middle of another one. In fact, Elizabeth calls it the digital Reformation. I think that these tools that are in our pockets, that are in the cloud, are fundamentally, they have different kinds of affordances, would be one way to talk about it, what we can do with them. And they're reshaping how we imagine ourselves in relation to God, how we imagine what God is doing in the world. And all of those questions are just permeating up in wonderful and sometimes very challenging ways. Keith and I, when we were talking about this, we were trying to think about what does it mean to do table talk, we decided we would title this, Now You See It. And the reason we entitled it that was because we think that digital media are actually quite disruptive in a lot of ways. They disrupt our taken for granted ways of thinking about the world. And sometimes they're disruptive enough that we see things that we wouldn't otherwise have noticed. And that disruption can actually, it can be a source of great discomfort. It's not just it's not always just a pleasant thing to experience. But it also gives us, I believe, new ways to listen to the Holy Spirit, to listen for the Holy Spirit, to listen for the ways in which Word is coming alive all around us. And we thought one way we might entice you into trying to stay awake right after lunch is by showing you a very short video that we think captures some of this disruption of seeing. So, I think we might have to have somebody up in the booth actually click it.
Do you want to just click the space bar there, Aaron? Thanks.
There we go. So I don't know whether you could actually see some of the shifting perspectives of that commercial, but one of the things that's really fun about how it's filmed is you get one story at the beginning. I don't know if you could tell what that was, but people receive it as this teenager who's off by himself, immersed in his phone, kind of isolated from all the family stuff. And then there's this shift that happens, and you begin to see that actually he was involved in everything, and he was creating something that then brought joy to the whole. And I think it's the both and there, right? I think that there are all sorts of ways in which we have authentic and legitimate fears about how these media come into our spaces and permeate our practices. But I think we also want to talk about not just the fears, but what is life-giving, and the ways in which the enhanced participation and creativity that's possible come into our lives. This shift in meaning, this disruption, if you will, I think we've just had a moment of that in our shared culture in the United States around the election. I think, this has come up off and on in the last day and a half. And I think that regardless of how you think about the election, right, I think most people realize that it wasn't business as usual, and that in some ways it exposes some really deep divides that live amongst us. And I think that what it can expose us to is the brokenness and the lack of connection, but that's also an invitation, right? That's an invitation to find ways in which, instead of living into polarization being, these divides in which people literally cannot respect each other for the ideas they hold, instead of falling into that, there are some narratives, some ideas, some ways in which Lutherans in particular think about this. I mean, I'll say Catholics do too, but I think that Lutherans have some very specific, helpful ways of imaginative ways of thinking about this. And I think a piece of that really comes in beginning to open ourselves up to seeing something we hadn't let ourselves see before. But enough about me, maybe.
Yeah, I think one of the big storylines about the election, following the election, was the role that technologies played, social media had played in the election or the campaigns, and then the election. And there have been a lot of stories about how these social media platforms that even their creators kind of saw as kind of benignly neutral were used, they were gamed, they were fake news, they had algorithms that they use for Google search or for what shows up in your Facebook feed were kind of gamed so that people were oftentimes getting not only misinformation but radically different information in that. And that is one of the things that we must come to terms with in this election is the role of technology and how it shapes us, how it reflects us, how it can bring out our worst and our best, our sinner and our saint, often in the same few moments on a Facebook newsfeed, depending on what it is you're consuming. And one of the kind of aha moments after the election was when I was directed to this website at the Wall Street Journal called Blue Feed, Red Feed. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but I, like many people, even people who won the election or lost the election, I think most people felt shocked about the results because we had seen the polling and it seemed all to kind of coincide in a certain direction. And so caused me personally, and I think caused a lot of us to kind of reflect on what was I seeing, what was I listening to. So Blue Feed, Red Feed is a project at the Wall Street Journal where, and it's still up and running now, where they will show side by side kind of a liberal social media feed and a conservative social media feed. And it's updated hourly even now, and this is just a screenshot. And so on the conservative side, you have Sean Hannity saying that Bernie Sanders praised Donald Trump. Think about that constellation of folks. And then on the liberal side, kind of this Russian spy link to Donald Trump and so forth. And as I spent time on that, and you can click through the different topics, Hillary Clinton or President Obama or the Affordable Care Act, radically, amazingly different feeds. And so for me, that was part of the aha moment was, even if in my imagination, my perhaps wildest imagination, I couldn't imagine that people were reading such different things, consuming such different information, having such different conversations, and explains sort of that kind of out-of-body reality-bending shock that I had late on election night as things continue to roll in. And this is partly because we're living now in what they call a Web 3.0 world. So if Web 1.0 was really about the accessibility of information, like my first church website that I inherited when I started was just all about, was informational. You know, here's information about our church and what we believe and our, you know, what we do.
Liturgy times.
Yes, pretty much. And it was static. You know, there's one guy that knew a little bit of HTML, and he was our webmaster. But then, so if the kind of first iteration of the web was about access to information, Web 2.0 was really about social media, was then we have this information, and then how do we engage around it? You know, how do we engage each other on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube, and these other technologies? And Web 3.0 is sort of the customized web, where news and information comes to you. So your web experience is personalized. So, you know, if each of us did a Google search for the same topic, we'd all get different results. I think we often assume that whatever you Google and I Google are the same, and it differs depending on your search history, where you are located, maybe the device you're using and searching from. And so each of us is actually looking at something different all the time, even though we might be using the same social network or the same search engine. And so this customized web is the reason where, you know, when I'm shopping on Amazon and then I go back to Facebook and I see the Amazon ad for the thing I just looked at and put on my wish list, or Netflix has, you know, suggestions for you based on, you know, my previous viewing, or my Spotify, you know, music streaming service has a weekly playlist that it puts together for me automatically based on the things I've already listened to. And so my web experience, though I share it with all of you, literally all of you if you're online, we share that experience together. It's a very unique and customized experience, and so that explains part of the reason why we've been sort of cordoned off from one another. And it's true that we also do that ourselves, right? When we unfriend or we unfollow someone or friends, we are customizing our own newsfeed. You know, I don't want to see any more posts by this person that disagrees with me, and so we really curate our own, you know, streams as well and experiences, and we take them as we take it for granted. So to borrow, you know, a metaphor from St. Paul with the hand and the eye and the ear and the foot, it's not that we're arguing about who's best, it's that we don't know each other exists. The hand and the foot and the eye and the ear, they don't even know each other's there. And I think that is part of the thing to reckon with coming out of the election. And for me as a pastor, the great heartbreak of that, even with, you know, within a community of faith, such as we are.
It's one of the things that I think these technologies make us, it feels like it's the World Wide Web. So the information is out there, and we increasingly use it to share photos and to share stories, and we begin to feel like it's just a reflection of the world we're living in. And that's, you know, that makes a certain amount of sense, right? Like you know the stories of the people immediately around you. But what we are not often aware of is how much the algorithms, this is the piece that Keith was talking about, behind those sites shift things so that you're seeing only the things that most conveniently the algorithm thinks you want to see. In some ways, that's really useful, right? Like when you're searching for something and you find it in the first page of results, that's awesome. The problem is if you think those are the only results, right? So one of the people who has been for a long time thinking a lot about not just the polarization, but a kind of a deeply Christian-seated spirituality for how do we know as we are known, is a philosopher and religious educator named Parker Palmer. And he has a book that came out, I think it's actually now 2 years ago, called Healing the Heart of Democracy, where he's been thinking a lot about these challenges. And he talks in particular about 5 habits he thinks we need to begin to cultivate, 5 habits of the heart. The first one is an understanding that we are all in this together. The second is an appreciation of the value of otherness. The third is an ability to hold tension in life-giving ways. The fourth is a sense of personal voice and agency. And the fifth is a capacity to create community. And I have to say I've been struck already today, just in presentations yesterday and this morning, about the ways in which some of these themes already are starting to emerge. I think Palmer is particularly adept at finding ways to talk about these realities that don't draw on theological language that is increasingly unfamiliar to people. But in this space, and for the purposes of what we're doing, we want to try to pull out some of those theological pieces and remind you of some of the resources that live in our shared traditions. I want to start with the first one of an understanding that we're all in this together. I think, contrary sometimes to what popular culture might suggest to you, Christianity really is grounded in this assertion. And I suppose we could quibble over what this is when we say we're all in this together. But I would just say from my own tradition that Pope Francis, his travels and the ways in which he talks about our common home and care for our common home, he's lifting up that sense that we are really in this together. And I think we have to think about the ways in which our digital practices, right? So Facebook feeds or Twitter, or even just how you share photos with people, or maybe you don't think you have any digital practices, but you still watch television, which these days is largely digital, or you still, I think we have to think about, are there ways in which these practices and our commitments are hiding the reality that we're all in this together, right? Are we, in fact, if you want, kind of cowering from God, hiding behind the fig leaf, pretending, or are we recognizing that we really are in this together?
Yeah, Heidi Campbell has this great phrase. She says, "We are one in the network." And it's from an early book when she was tracking people who were connecting around issues of religion and spirituality, and with email listservs and message boards, like kind of very early social kind of technologies, or they weren't even social technologies, but people were using them that way. And she kind of makes this point, even at that stage, that we're all one in the network, so we may be curating our own, Facebook feeds or Twitter streams. We may forget that one another is there, which I think in many ways we have done. But we are still connected. The body is still, these parts are still connected, but we've lost sight of it.
Yeah, and there's the opportunity there, right? There's the opportunity to engage these tools with practices that actually remind us, right? Or that draw us more deeply into that. The second piece that Parker Palmer talks about has to do with appreciation of the value of otherness. And I think that both Holly and Matt this morning were trying to find some ways to invite us into that through thinking about biblical texts. The letters of Paul, for instance, which is not necessarily the place I would have immediately gone to think about otherness. But I think the thing that Parker Palmer would say, and I would add this to what Matt and Holly were saying, is that when we talk about unity, we're not talking about uniformity, right? There's a difference between unity and uniformity, and I think sometimes those two words get collapsed on top of each other. I love, for instance, I started here at Luther in the year 2000, and the year right before, the Lutheran World Federation and the Vatican came to an agreement about the doctrine of justification. And part of what I love about particularly the Canadian bishops' publication of that agreement was that they had the agreement, and then they would say, when Lutherans would describe it this way, Catholics would describe it this way, Lutherans would describe it this way. So it was an agreement, it was unity, but it wasn't uniformity. And I think that there's a capaciousness in our tradition that allows for that, that we want to hold on to. Parker Palmer has this thing, I feel like I should put it on a bumper sticker somewhere. The more diverse the knowers, the more robust the knowing. Okay, so the more diverse the knowers, the more difference we have in our community of people, of knowers, the more robust our knowing will be, right? It's kind of like a kaleidoscope. You've got multiple pieces forming a picture together. And that's something that I remember when I first started at Luther. Our president then was David Teedy, and I remember thinking, well, why do you want a Roman Catholic on your faculty? And one of the things that he said to me was, the Bible itself, if you think about the canon that holds the four Gospels, the Bible itself enshrines difference and contradictions, right? There are different parts of the four Gospels that disagree with each other, not let alone contradictions in the wider corpus. So that's at the heart of who we are, and that's not something to be afraid of. That's something to be embraced, something to allow to become part of our understanding of the body. And this is where I think digital media hold both the opportunity for great harm and for great abundance and good. You can, as we've mentioned, you could live in your own bubble. You can live in your tiny little space, only observing information from people who agree with you. And you might not even intentionally mean to do that, but just the very way in which you do searches on the web and the cookies that are left in the browser shape what your next search is going to be. So you might not even realize you're doing it, and yet you're becoming part of this smaller bubble. Or you can be intentional, and you can think about how do you actually expand the set of sources that you're working with. How do you think about how do you reach out beyond that particular bubble?
Right, and I think there's a corrective there. For me, being in digital spaces is often a corrective to some of our tendencies to look inward.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to think about the church as what happens in the building, and instead trying to reach out into our local communities and be present there, or being in touch with kind of the broader conversations that are happening around the church or not inside the church, and being connected to that. So that kind of expansiveness of our network lives, which gets messy and complicated and sometimes quite divisive, also draws us out of our particular communities and contexts into something, a larger conversation.
And one of the things that's at the heart of this stuff is story. So I do a lot of work around stories. In fact, you can find some of these examples at a website I run called storyingfaith.org. And you heard Lois yesterday, excuse me, why am I spacing on who was presenting with Lois? Scott. Lois and Scott yesterday talk about how important stories are and story is. And one of the things I've been struck by in the last couple days is the unintended consequences of the travel ban that President Trump imposed. And part of what I saw from those unintended consequences were stories of people. All the stories of people who got caught up in it that I think were not part of the intentionality, if you will, of that particular executive order. But absent the net, absent the kinds of stuff we have now, I wouldn't know those stories, right? I wouldn't know who was stuck in the airport. I wouldn't know any of that stuff. But with the net, we have those stories shared, and that's part of the opportunity and part of the challenge. Okay, let's see. So how do we start to think about what it means to appreciate difference? And one of the stories I was thinking about as we were preparing and talking about this is I've spent the last year up in Toronto. And the first couple weeks that I was there, I was looking for a church. Probably some of you have either had the experience of people coming to your church to look, or you've been in the position of that. And I must have gone to 5 or 6 looking for the one that was the right church. And of course, I was experiencing dislocation. I was living by myself for the first time in my life. I was in a whole other country. And there was not a space that felt comfortable. People genuflected more than I was used to, or they were singing different music, or I was just. And it took me a while to calm down and realize, you know what? I have to make a commitment. I have to just pick a church and live with it for a while. I have to really let myself live into the discomfort of it until I can actually build some relationships. And I think that this is one of the things that we have to help model for people, or to help apprentice people into. There's this lovely story that one of my friends tells me frequently. She's a doctor, a physician who does a lot of stuff with brains and imagery. And there's a part of your brain, a very primitive early part of the brain, that when you are confronted with an idea with which you disagree, you kind of freeze up, or you want to flee, or maybe you want to fight. It's the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. But one of the things that I find so powerful that she keeps sharing is that there's another part of the brain, they call it a more evolved part, that actually can overcome that. I feel like saying, anybody know what that part is? The piece that I love about this is that it's the part of the brain that lights up when you wonder about something, or when you engage with some awe, right? So how do we invite people into wonder? Well, gosh, think about religious community. If we can't figure out how to do that, I don't know who's going to do that, right? And one way we do it, I think, or can do it very pragmatically in our own spaces around some of these very difficult politics that we're living into or other kinds of challenges, is by setting up, designing spaces that allow for a respectful conversation, that allow for wondering about each other, that allow for, if you will, not trying to change anybody's mind, but trying to better understand how somebody who has a very different understanding came to view that understanding. And I like to think about that actually as table talk.
Yes.
But you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, table talk. Today in the digital age, the best part of this whole process is we had all these Skype conversations from Toronto to Philadelphia, and we kept drawing ourselves back. It's like, oh no, we would get off on this, and we're so excited. It's like, but that's not our topic,
Yeah, what this
we had to come back around, and I've heard that in all the presentations, and it was just so exciting to really kick around these ideas, and such a gift. But as we think about table talk today, I wonder how respectful those conversations were in that way, right? Luther,
Right.
of course, could be blustery and belligerent and had opinions on everything, and he was precisely sure about all of them. But he did gather people together around the table for conversation and saw that it was important enough for him and those who were gathered to record them, to hold on to them and to pass them around. And it's been interesting to me to think about the role that the place that table talk holds in sort of our collective Lutheran consciousness. That table talk is more of kind of an apocryphal part of our Lutheran tradition, rather than sort of the canon of Luther's writings, the theological treatises, his preaching, his teaching, his translating. That table talk has been this kind of nice, cute thing that's part of not that you would describe Luther as nice and cute, but this kind of quaint part of our tradition that's kind of nice to dip into for a good quote, here and there. And in so many ways, we've modeled ourselves on Dr. Luther rather than Herr Luther or Martin around those tables. So, Nadia Bolz-Weber has this great line. She says, Lutherans think they're saved by theological precision. And I think it can be quite true, rather than just grace alone. But I think as we're in this networked world that we are in a time where conversations are coming to the fore. Whether it's socially and because it's facilitated and mediated by these digital technologies that we have, by these digital devices that we carry around, that I can be texting my daughter, who right now is in Quebec City, or with my wife back at home in Philadelphia, or Facebook and Twitter, and calling back at the office at church to see how things are. All of those connections happening, from my phone, just from this. And so I think socially, culturally, we're moving to this place where conversation is really coming to the fore, and seeing that also in educational learning spaces, which you know far more about than me, but my experience of that is I have 4 kids. I have a 13-year-old daughter, a 10-year-old son, and 8-year-old twin girls. And it has been such a revelation for me to watch how they learn in school. So they're 8th grade, 5th grade, and 2nd grade. And how all of their learning is so digitally integrated. They're using Google Classroom. They watch, my son plays clarinet, and he watches how to do things on YouTube about playing the clarinet, how you do your lips and how you breathe, and doing breathing exercises along with the YouTube video. And my girl's coming home and on the iPad or computer doing Zern, which is a learning platform where they go through it and they do it, and then their teacher gets a notice for each student about what they struggled with, in the midst of the lesson, if anything. And then can focus that on the classroom, so the teaching is much more customized to where they are. And one night we went to an open house in my son's classroom. This was last year in 4th grade. And you go to the open houses, and there's like the finger painted things and all the art projects that they seemingly just do because open house is coming up, to have something to show. And the first thing that Finn took me to was this bank of Chromebooks, these little computers. And he flipped it open and said, "These are the projects I've been working on." Here's his Google slide set about whatever topic he was studying, and so he was taking me through all the different classrooms and spaces, and it just kind of blew me away as somebody that feels like I know something about this space, to see my kids doing that, and they do like PowerPoints for fun, now, which blows me away. So our kind of social lives, our cultural lives together, our civic life together, but also the ways that learning is changing. It's much more digitally integrated, networked, and conversational, shifting from kind of the sage on the stage, the expert at the front of the room, to the guide on the side, where the classroom time and that flipped classroom model is really about collaboration, and the work at home is really more about the information. And I think we see sort of this move in the church in some ways in this kind of re-embrace of table talk as it's expressed for many people in pub theology or coffee shop office hours that have been getting more traction, and which I also practice, as well as getting together with people on Zoom calls or Skype calls, or connecting with colleagues, not just in your local ministerium, but around the country, scheduling a Skype call to check in and see how things are going with a colleague or a group of colleagues. And those things have always been there. Those conversations have always been going on, except now I think they're coming more to the fore. And it's always been part of our tradition, that table talk. But I think it's something that we need to recover in order to be able to connect with people, both digitally in those digital spaces, but also locally in online spaces. And I love what Gordon Kaufman, who's a constructivist theologian, says about this. Back in 1993, I'm sure I skipped some slides by getting...
there you go. See, conversation.
Hey, we'll come back to that. So Kaufman says this. He said, it's been a mistake in the Christian churches to think of theology as basically ideology rather than conversation. That is, to suppose that theology is essentially a body of truths that can be defined clearly and can be passed on from generation to generation, instead of an activity requiring continuous adjustment of the thinking of each of us to all the others with whom we are ipso facto thinking together. He says, I suggest that the proper model for conceiving theology is not a lecture, a monologue, nor is it a text, for example, a book. It is rather conversation. We are all in this mystery together, and we need to question one another, criticize one another, make suggestions to one another, and help one another.
To which I couldn't help but want to add some quotes from Pope Benedict, which is not the current Pope, but the one previously. So here are some quotes from Pope Benedict. The desire for connectedness and the instinct for communication that are so obvious in contemporary culture are best understood as modern manifestations of the basic and enduring propensity of humans to reach beyond themselves and to seek communion with others. In reality, when we open ourselves to others, we are fulfilling our deepest need and becoming more fully human. Loving is, in fact, what we are designed for by our Creator. Which actually reminds me of something that Lois was saying yesterday, too. And in the final analysis, the truth of Christ is the full and authentic response to that human desire for relationship, communion, and meaning, which is reflected in the immense popularity of social networks.
He wasn't all bad.
No, he wasn't all bad. Had to sneak some in there somewhere.
So we are all in this together, and not but, and we think differently. And we need that togetherness and those differences to fully engage the mystery at the heart of our faith. That's the point that Kaufman's making. And one of the ways I've been living this out in my parish ministry, and I'm kind of your typical parish pastor, suburbs outside of Philadelphia, is that we've been hosting a theology pub that we call God on Tap for 4 years at our local little brewery owned by two young guys, and I've been meeting there once a month, every month for about 4 years. And it's a place where we come together and the focus is conversation. So I'm not making a presentation where it's not a Bible study. There's a topic that I will announce in advance to give people time to think about. And then we come together and I sort of just say, reminder, this is what the topic is, and we throw it open. And we talk for a little over an hour. And it's been such a a gift, a really great experience, but really a growing edge for me as a pastor. Because I had this notion of myself as preacher, standing at the pulpit, proclaiming, or teacher, standing at the head of the classroom, teaching whatever it is, or, it could be at the men's breakfast or the confirmation class. And that kind of sage on the stage, the kind of the resident expert or the resident theologian. And I read this book by Brian Berghoff called Pub Theology, and looking for ways to kind of approach this new God on Tap project that we wanted to do. And I read through the book once, and I said, well, that's not a program. that's not a plan. I need, give me something more tangible. And then I read it again, and what he was really kind of pushing his reader, pushing me to really think about is how to facilitate conversation. And in the midst of that conversation, learning about each other and learning about God in the midst of it. And so I kind of have called that doing theology without a net, without kind of all of the deferences to the pastor or, that I'm the expert or that we're going to wrap it up neatly in a bow at the end of the hour, but to live with the open-endedness and the multitude of questions that come forward in the midst of the conversation. That's right. So theology without a net, but really a giving up of some privilege in the midst of that space, to not have the answers, but to hold the space for people as they share. And so just kind of as timing would have it, we had a God on Tap night on Tuesday night just before I flew here yesterday morning, which was a crazy thing to do, to have a pub night on Tuesday and then fly out of Philadelphia at 7 a.m. Wednesday morning, but there it was. And I've been wondering every month, it's kind of a trick to figure out what's the topic going to be, but I've been having these conversations lately that people were sharing with me about post-election, even during the campaign, but post-election, how difficult it had been to have conversations with good friends and family members about the election, about how people were feeling about it. And this has become, I don't know about for you, but it's become a place of pastoral care for me. In the days since the election, people, young adults at college reaching out to me, or online on Facebook, and people sharing these stories. Just had lunch with a guy this past week who's really struggling. Well, what does it mean now to be Christian, or church, or how are we following Jesus now? And so it's been a real big part of the pastoral care. So what we did on Tuesday night, we had our topic was how to have difficult conversations. And I asked somebody I know, she's sort of daughter of the congregation. Family's not too involved, but I did her wedding with her and her husband last year, and she had been trained at Penn State University in the World in Conversation program, which was a center for public diplomacy. And so I asked her if she would come. We rarely have special guests because we wanted to be more conversational, but this was about how to have the conversation, which is this very meta kind of moment for God on Tap, to really kind of step back and think about our process. But she came, and she gave us she kind of facilitated us as we were also learning skills to take home with us. So she said, don't start with why questions. Why questions can put people on the defensive. Ask what or how. And she would catch us as we were talking and say, could you rephrase that? Could you reframe that? And how to bring our genuine curiosity to those conversations, or how to do reflective listening, which we know about, but forget to do oftentimes. And so it was really amazing, and we talked about the election and human rights and healthcare and the marching and the protests more and better than we have had the opportunity to since the election. It was really kind of a remarkable moment. And then somebody said, there are a lot of people that came to this, and we should do this at church. We have a larger kind of audience, and Carly could come back. And one of the guys afterwards who comes every month says, I don't know that this would fly in church. It was really good to have it at the pub. There was something about the beer, I'm sure, but then also the setting that diffused a lot of the kind of tension that might go along with being in that space together. But if we think for a moment, kind of beyond the church, and I catch myself when I say beyond the church, because that's assuming, that's saying a statement about how in the foreground the church is for me and for us. If we think about how these conversations might connect us to people who are not just in our congregations, but in our communities, whether they're online or locally. Elizabeth Drescher, who is like such a great mutual friend and colleague of both of us, and it's hard when Elizabeth and I are together because I quote her all the time, so I can't do that in her presence, so we have to figure out other things to say, but she's not here, so we can quote her
exactly.
at length. And she has this great book that came out last year called Choosing Our Religion, The Spiritual Lives of America's Nuns.
N-O-N-E-S.
The religiously unaffiliated, the nuns. And I think it's just I just would recommend it to any ministry leader to read.
Excellent book.
Because she travels around, she did online research and then did one-on-ones and focus groups.
She did some of them here in the Twin Cities.
Yeah. With people who are nuns, who are not religiously affiliated. And she captures their stories in such powerful ways. And she asked them, so, not in so many words, but so if you don't go to church, you're not part of a faith community, you don't identify with a particular religion, what are the things that are spiritually meaningful for you? Kind of what are we would say, the spiritual practices in which you make meaning? And people share this with her, and she compiled them, and she said, she said there are 4 F's and a P. So time with family, time with friends, preparing and sharing food together, pets, Fido, which she says is Fido, and prayer. And she said, so prayer, she said, in that top 5, prayer is the real, and you can go further down the list, and some, the more traditional practices.
Even just the section of her book on prayer is wonderful.
Yeah, just those 2 chapters are really great. But, so for the people that we talk about wanting to connect with all the time, and who feel just beyond our reach, being this kind of conversational, relational, kind of networked way of being in ministry is exactly where people are. And then, she also said, when I talked to people who are religiously affiliated and asked them what are the practices, she said they were the same, except time with family and time with friends were a little flipped because church folk tend to, be more settled with family. Yeah. So we actually share that in common, this kind of relational, conversational ways that we make meaning, inside and outside the church. Yeah. She has this great example. So when I went through her book, I highlighted all the places where she talked about Lutherans, because that's what you do. So I put a little L, and so I was thinking about this and looked back, and I found all my little L's, like Lutheran nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And she talks about this one woman, Margaret. This is from the researcher Meredith McGuire. And she talks about Margaret as kind of one of these people, she says, who valued gardening, which is really her spiritual practice, in part because it allowed her to prepare healthier meals for her family. She donated excess food from her garden to a local food bank and participated in a weekly prayer circle, which, along with the healing effects of working the soil and connecting with nature, was important to her own well-being. And then Elizabeth reflects, little in Margaret's spiritual life seemed unconnected to others, uninfluenced by relationships with family, friends, and nature. So it's really relational. And so I think if we look at this through the lens of vocation, which I think is something we also really need to recover in our own tradition for this time, we can see her work as a holy work and her practice as a spiritual practice. And if we could think about how to, rather than finding a place for her in our church, having the church find a place in her holy work,
Right.
Would be a powerful thing. So, yeah.
Well, let's keep going. So number 3, Parker Palmer's ability to hold tension in life-giving ways. My goodness, this is hard. So I grew up in Wisconsin, in a fairly typical stoic Wisconsin family, and tension was always held in silence. Disagreements could lead to anger. Anger tended to lead to separation. I actually grew up in a divorced family, so you silenced strong feelings. You kept them down. I'm thinking about what Holly was saying earlier. I don't know how many of you have seen the film Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. That's kind of the latest Harry Potter film. And there's a thing that happens in the film. There's something called an obscuro, which has to do with when the very strong emotions that are emerging in a person who's gifted in this particular way, it becomes actually like a terrific hurricane monster almost. And it's really this question about how are we suppressing what we're feeling. I think sometimes the concern around what is politically correct is that we're repressing what our feelings are rather than trying to figure out how do we have civil discourse? How do we respect each other? How do we do that in ways that lead to, in fact, one of my favorite metaphors for this actually is the architect Buckminster Fuller. He's the guy who did the geodesic domes. You maybe know him. Coined this term, tensegrity, tension plus integrity. And his notion was that you could build really stable structures by holding competing forces together, but with respect to their individual integrity. So he was talking about compression and elongation and those kinds of forces, but I think that image, rather than kind of melting pot or assimilation, or it reminds me a little bit maybe of what I think Holly might have been trying to hint at with radical welcome. There's tension that's involved. It's not easy, and I think this is, for me, have been one of the gifts of being at Luther Seminary, is living into what's the law promise dialectic, what's the saint-sinner kind of space for thinking about that. That we live with these really competing forces, but they're held together, and they're held together with a very particular kind of integrity. Death leads to life. Like that's at the heart of what we are confessing.
So you think of Buckminster Fuller, and I think of Gordon Lathrop.
There you go.
We talk about tension and juxtaposition. In Holy Things, I had Gordon during my Lutheran year at Philadelphia, and we would talk about the juxtaposition, the tension in the liturgy that was created, where we take font and table, word, preaching and prayers, the gathering and sending, and the tension, the juxtaposition between them, of course, he said, animates it for us and takes these ordinary things and makes them extraordinary. These common human materials, meeting, gathering, book, washing, meal, song, speech, and then we see how communal meaning occurs as these things are juxtaposed to each other. It was so fun to actually think back and read back on that. And one of the things he liked that I think just fits right in about how we gather people, he said the task of the assembly is the task of polarity. Make the center strong, the symbols large, the words of Christ clear, and at the same time, I can hear him saying it, at the same time, make the center accessible, the circle large, the periphery permeable. And so I think our liturgies give us an avenue to be practicing, living in those tensions.
Yeah, I think there's at least the potential for that. And I think one of the challenges is that not everybody has had that experience in liturgy, so they don't even know how to think about it. I do a lot of work around something called digital storytelling as a form of faith formation, and we thought as an illustration, actually, of kind of what we're talking about, we'd bring this particular story. So the story we're going to show you is by a woman named Annabelle Prophet. Digital storytelling is a way of helping people find their own story, their own narrative, and then layering it with music and image and things. So this one is about 3 minutes long.
Yeah, it's not popping up. Aaron, can you advance the slide and see?
There
Yeah,
it is.
great.
And then click it
Thanks. It takes a minute to start.
to start up.
I grew up on Wonder Bread. It was what my family could afford. One loaf could feed our family far more inexpensively than a designer loaf from a bakery. Peanut butter and jelly, bologna with mayonnaise. But over the years, I've come to disdain cheap white bread as unhealthy, and I'm ashamed to admit, lower class fare. So that day, I was dismayed to see the slices of white bread laid out on the communion table in our seminary chapel. Could anything feel more incongruent with the soaring Gothic architecture of the chapel that represented my high church leanings? Usually, we used beautiful homemade loaves of crusty, wholesome grains when we served communion. I sat in my pew conflicted, trying to figure out why this felt so disturbing. I loved the sacrament of communion. I just didn't love this bread. It was as though my child self was in that pre-sliced white bread, and I didn't know what to do with that. Then it came to me. I had only been permitted to start taking communion when I was 13 years old. I'd never been permitted to bring my child self to the table. But that day in the seminary chapel, that Wonder Bread on the table, ushered my child self in and invited her to partake of the grace offered at this holy meal. As we went forward to receive the bread, I reached out my hand, and as the server said, "This is the body of Christ, broken for you," the broken places of my childhood seemed to inhabit that small piece of torn white Wonder Bread. Brokenness shared, somehow, has healing power. I'll never look at Wonder Bread the same way.
She has found a way to tell her story in the heart tones of the tradition. And I think that one of the challenges that we have is that digital media are very participatory in a lot of ways, and people have a lot of sense of agency with them. You can comment, you can create, you can do all of that. And the question is, what happens when they walk into church? Do they have that same sense of participation and creativity? I mean, I think liturgy is a deeply participatory thing, but then again, I'm a seminary professor, of course I'm going to think that. But, you know, that my 19-year-old son doesn't, right? So the question is, what are the things that we can do? What can we draw on? Some of the practices that people are inhabiting right now. This is what Elizabeth Drescher's work is really good about, too. How do people have voice and agency in religious community? And I think for me, as a Roman Catholic, learning about the pieces of this Reformation from this angle, the table talk piece for me, I know it gets told in nostalgic or silly ways, but it's really, for me, always about bringing it home, right? It's about a family gathered. It's about people in their daily lives really thinking about these questions. And I think part of what social media and other digital tools afford us is the opportunity to enter into that stream.
Right, so just, you know, as this was kind of one part, Table Talk is one part of Luther's push to put the locus of religion in the home, in everyday life, and vocation, the priesthood of all believers. And so I love what Charles Taylor described, you know, how people thought about the home and gathering. He called it a zone of spiritual underdevelopment in the time of Luther. And what Luther did in the course of the Reformation was to affirm ordinary life. And so you had table talk, you had the small catechism for the transmission of faith in the home, understanding of Christian vocation and the priesthood of all believers that we're each ministers in our daily lives. He writes about the holiness of changing diapers, which when I was having, you know, all my 4 young kids, I was just holding on to it. This is a holy work. This is holy work. Especially with twins, especially with double the diapers. You know, and being good and honest and fair at your trade, that was a holy thing. And also in the way that in his pastoral letters, you know, that he counseled people in their everyday concerns and worries. But this is another part for me of our Lutheran heritage that we lose sight of. It's there, it's important, it's powerful, and it's really about maybe foregrounding and backgrounding or finding a balance between all of those pieces. But I like what Dave Lowe says in his book, Preaching at the Crossroads, about our congregational life. He says we operate mainly in a couple different zones. We operate sort of in our preaching specifically in sort of the congregational zone, and we reflect on the life of our congregation, and we operate in the global zone, which, you know, kind of issues of national or global concern. And he says what we're missing is this middle zone in between those. And he says, you have jobs, looking for a job, relationships, parenting, managing too many things at once, money, family, school, hobbies, volunteering, the media, local current events, the stuff that constitutes our daily lives, he says, often seems to be painfully absent from much of our preaching. And I think it's absent from a lot of our ministry in general, you know, and I've been really convicted about this, in part because of my own spiritual journey with having kids, because I would go on silent retreat to the monastery. That was where I was fed, and then all these kids came along, and somehow that wasn't happening anymore. And so how could I find God truly in the midst of changing the diapers when I felt like I should be finding God in the silence of a monastery? And so personally for me, that's been incredibly life-giving. And out of that, being able to share that with my congregation and listen for that in my congregation, reflect back, it opened up things in them that I could not have, like wonderful connections to God for them that I could not have, anticipated or predicted.
If you take nothing else from us today, take from us that social media, that digital tools allow you to listen to your contexts well. Listening to you, I'm thinking about the ways in which people will often tell me they don't want to be anywhere near Facebook because people are only talking about what they ate for dinner and their cats and whatever. And the point is, that's the gritty granularity of daily life. And when you already have a relationship with somebody, those little bits and glimpses are things that help to sustain the relationship, right? And as a pastoral leader, being in those spaces too and sharing bits and pieces of your own life, one of the things I love about Click to Save as a book is that it gives you ways to do that without boundary issues. There's a lot of really good advice in there, but that sort of daily nitty-gritty is really important.
But if you go back to Elizabeth's categories, time with family, time with friends, pets, food, what are people posting about on social media? All those things that we often poo-poo is like, I can't take one more cat picture, for goodness sakes. But that's the way that this person is making meaning. And they're sharing that meaning making with you. And that's an invitation, right? That's different. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. I want to say the last one that Parker Palmer talked about is a capacity create community. And I think rather than some of what I was going to say, do you want to talk about the video? Because I really want to share that video.
Slate project.
Yeah. Can we talk about the Slate project?
Yes. So one of the things, one of the ministries that I love, that captures this living in local and digital spaces that I seem to be writing about, talking about all the time lately is the Slate Project, which is a multi-denominational mission start in Baltimore. And they're very intentional about gathering in local spaces and also including using digital technologies to kind of extend that community beyond the neighborhood with people really around the world. And so there's this great video that was put together by the Episcopal Church, which is one of the sponsoring bodies that captures some of that. And we wanted to share that with you about a way of thinking about community that is broader than just our congregations and broader than just our physical local communities, but how they can be bridged and brought together. So, Aaron, could you click?
A lot of people that we have connected with in Slate, they'll never step foot in a church building. And that doesn't mean that they're even spiritual, that they're not looking for something. The Slate Project is a new kind of Christian community that's both online and face-to-face.
We're a tri-denominational church, Lutheran, Episcopal, and Presbyterian, that is both ancient and future. We're ecumenical in a lot of ways. We're post-denominational, and we're all about creating community that exists both in Baltimore but also online.
It's trying to imagine what Christianity could be with a blank slate. It's recognizing that a lot of crap has built up over the past 2,000 years. We're trying to wipe away a lot of that crap, while still recognizing that there are pieces of this brilliant tradition that we hold on to.
But we don't have our own building. We meet in borrowed space. We have a dinner church every Monday night. We meet in space that's loaned to us by the cathedral. And we meet in local coffee shops for things like our leadership team meetings, our Bible studies. We are always meeting out in the city because really the city is our church.
We get so attached to our buildings, right? I mean, do we mean what we say? Especially when we say the church is more than the building, the church is the community gathered, the body of Christ in the world. I think we talk that talk really well, but we rarely do it. Face-to-face is a wonderful way to be a part of the Christian community. But online is also a way to do it, and it's kind of amazing. Throughout a given week, we have almost 10 different ways that people can connect in like real, meaningful ways.
A whole thing of ministry that you're always taught is know your people, know your congregation. But I think we've also limited ourselves to think that our congregation are those that are sitting in our pews and not recognizing that our congregation is our community.
A lot of people in this age, in this 21st century, they communicate online. I wanted that to be a big piece of this. Not just to use the internet to be cool or be hip, but to say, where are people? That's where we need to be.
We have a tweet chat every Thursday night, and the topic usually has to do with our theme for the season. We recommend that everybody read an article or watch a video, so we have like a common starting point. But we also intentionally include sharing of who we are. We're starting to introduce times to share like prayer requests at the end, so really caring for each other, and then beginning and ending with prayer. So it really is church happening in real time online with people who are actually all over the world. We have someone who lives in Germany and gets up at 3 a.m. because it's 3 a.m. her time, and makes popcorn and joins in faithfully every week.
Sometimes I think from our pulpits we talk about a lot of fluff, and we don't talk about the radical, subversive Jesus that countered what culture was saying.
The Bible study that we have, we're trying to recover the Bible as a story worth telling, to a collection of really unique images of what it meant to follow Jesus in different times and places.
Our hope is that through the Slate Project that we're able to tell the Jesus story, but then also tell our own stories and hopefully give people concrete ways in which they're able to live out God's word or God's story.
Some would say we are a church without walls. We really try to be that both literally and figuratively. It's really important to us to be trying to intentionally break down the walls that keep people apart.
To be where they are and then communicate in a way that they can understand.
That's something that's really important to our identity.
I love that, and it does take a certain intentionality to do that. And I guess in the ways that I've tried and failed and tried again and experimented in trying to do those things, whether it was bringing technology into the congregation or using technology to reach beyond it, I've really been challenged and changed. And so the way that I do ministry altogether has kind of shifted in some of the ways that you might see there. So we want to engage you in some conversation with each other for the moment, and we're going to do a little exercise using some technology you might have on you. What we'd like you to do is to pull out your phones, and we want you to turn to your neighbor and find a photograph on your phone that speaks to you. And to share why that photo speaks to you, to your neighbor.
If you don't have a phone with photographs, you probably have a photograph in your wallet.
That's
so
right.
You can find a photograph to share.
So it's on your phone or your computer or in your wallet or on your keychain, wherever it might be. And if you just turn to your neighbor in pairs and pick one and show the person and explain why, and we'll just do that briefly back and forth. just another minute or so. If the second person hasn't had a chance to talk yet, please switch and we'll wrap it up in just a minute. Okay, I think we'll come back now. It's this is always the challenge when you get people talking to bring them back. The same thing at church. But if I keep talking, maybe we'll come back. That's sort of what we do. So yeah. Sorry.
Oh, point 4, sorry, was the personal voice and agency. That was the slide right before the Wonder Bread, and so I'm afraid it got kind of flipped there. And the 5th piece is capacity for creating community. And part of what we're trying to do by inviting you even into this exercise is to help you see that you actually already have some of that capacity, and that digital tools can be a catalyst for it.
Right, yeah, this was an exercise that I was invited to do at a conference I attended, and it was so stupidly simple. Like, it was like, oh yeah, I have this in my pocket. Oh, I have these stories to share, and you know, I've wondered, what if we did that at our churches, you know, in some way, and you know, and then asking, which we won't ask you to do now, but deeper questions like, is there anything that has a theological layer to what you shared, or the picture of a loved one that reminds you of God's love, or something from a recent trip that reminds you of God's creative power? There are lots of ways to get people talking with something that is in their pocket and close to them, and asking then kind of faith questions about it. It's one of the things that God on Tap we find most effective, to take some shared kind of experience, a life experience, and then ask faith questions about it as we go. So speaking of questions, we want to leave time for questions if there's anything interesting on Twitter, Don, and open up to the room. And see what you...
I think there's, I'll do the one off from Twitter from Matthew Fleming. Would Luther have been a troll? How to get over theological precision and open the theological conversation. So while I make my way around the room, if you want to think about that.
Would Luther have been a troll? Somehow I doubt it.
Yeah, well, he was all over the Pope. I mean, he'd be subtweeting the Pope all the time on Twitter.
But somehow, I mean, the thing, do you know what Matt means by trolls? I mean, trolls are people that go into comment feeds or Facebook feeds or Twitter stuff and are, well, they function a couple ways. They can pretend that that they're part of your group and then say really vituperative kinds of things, or they can, their aim is to create flame wars, basically, or to, and I doubt that, I mean, maybe this is me 500 years later wanting to think nicely about Martin Luther, the Catholic monk, but I doubt he was trying to create flame wars. I think he was trying to evoke real thought.
Yeah, I would say the troll would be too far. He would definitely subtweet, and you know, but there are people online who are not trolls, but like, I mean, people that I sort of follow online, this amazing intellectual horsepower and are incredibly prophetic, right? And use these tools, but they can also get up in your face a little bit, you know, check you on your privilege or whatever, and because they do both of those, they're not just out to gotcha all the time, but they're really doing this, kind of creating this body of work and trying to have this conversation. You know, you take it differently, which I think kind of where I would think of Luther as doing. Like, the whole project wasn't, you know, right?
nailing the
Wasn't-
thesis up on the
wasn't
wall.
trolling people. It was about what God's doing in the world.
I mean,
So, like,
I just want to, one other thing about that though is that I really think this is a place where one of the things that's really helpful about the net is that you can listen into conversations. So not just your own conversations as you're trying to figure out what's going on in your own community, but for instance, if you look like me and you carry a lot of white privilege and you think you want to really engage with dismantling racism, but you don't yet really have a lot of friends from other communities, there's all sorts of resources online that you can go to and listen in on those conversations as a way to begin to learn something.
You mentioned the nun whose gardening was a major part of her spirituality, and you said maybe the church should become part of her spirituality. What might that look like?
Yeah, I think part of my saying that was often would say, well, oh, look, we've got a program for you. We can slip you in right here. And I know the group that you would be a small group that you should be a part of. And I think really. What Elizabeth's work is helping to do is really to listen better for these ways that people make meaning. And so, and that takes time because it's about relationships. So for the people that, kind of appreciative inquiry for what this means to her, and talking about the things that as a person of faith, she's a nun, the things as a person of faith that, I hold to be dear, like care of creation and finding those connection points. So maybe an example is the guys that own our local pub are nuns, young guys, nuns. They do this amazing brewing, and they've created this real community of people that come to this pub. And in the conversations, and they actually are very outward oriented. They donate to the local food pantry and stuff. And so in the kind of a course of listening to the values that they hold to be important, I've been able to communicate, as a person of faith, the things that I and my church kind of hold of value, and be able to find a commonality there, something that we really share, and we are actually able to do a charity event together. And so like we did a beer tasting for charity where they provided the beer and talked about the beer they brew, and we provided sort of the logistics, and we raised like $3,000 for our local food pantry, which my church had supported and they had supported. But they're not church people, and they probably never will be. But we found this way of not trying to kind of slot them in, but to kind of partner together, which for me was like, wow, it's like one of those aha moments, just keep listening and keep talking.
I would piggyback on that and say the Lutheran understanding of vocation is a really rich one. And one of the exercises we used to do in a class called Exercises in Biblical Theology, so maybe the exercise is still happening in a different class, was we would send students out and ask them to follow somebody from their church, their home community, around for a day in their workplace and have lunch with them, and then just talk about how what they were doing in their daily life was part of their vocation. And what was fascinating to me about that was, as students would come back and report on what the experience had been, they would often say that the people they had followed had never had the opportunity to talk about what they were doing in their daily lives as part of their vocation. And I thought, wow. I mean, Lutherans in particular. But, they're little tiny things like that that don't have to be a lot of work or a program, but that help to connect people.
We talked about information bubbles, and it occurs to me that in Luther's time, many people must have been in a bubble that was very limited, just because of so few resources like books. But Luther manages to break out of this somehow beyond anybody else. And from his experience, what can we learn about breaking out of bubbles?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Let's think about hymns. Let's think about the way he did teaching hymns, where he put stuff into very popular tunes and had people singing them. When was the last time that you invited somebody to tell you about the popular music they love and what that says to them about who God is? You'd be surprised at some of the stories that will emerge for people. I mean, Luther did also, this is one of those places where I feel like I'm the Catholic that's trying to tell you, listen to the resources you have in your tradition, right? One of the things that I think he was alert to was a very keen sense that God was active, right? That in everything he did and everything around him, he could see God. He could also see Satan, but this sense of an active God. That's a really vibrant, rich, important resource, and helping people figure out how to weave their stories with God's story in daily life is crucial.
I think getting out of your digital comfort zone might help. Like we often talk about Facebook as like default for social media, and there's lots more social media. But if mostly we're on Facebook, and Facebook is really just primarily a reflection of the people that we already know.
Right.
It's really a reflection of our existing social networks. So for me, being on Twitter or other platforms where they're more kind of, you connect around issues or interests more than sort of pre-existing relationships or the friends of friends, that's been helpful. Less comfort zone for me, but being on different platforms has helped. And then I think really being intentional about the people that you're connected to. So Emily Scott at St. Lydia's in Brooklyn wrote this great blog post a while ago called Preaching While White in the wake of Ferguson. And she talked about a number of things, but one of the things was look at your social network. Who's in your social network, and are you hearing from the full diversity of the church even? And I started following I started following a number of other people, African American leaders and congregations and news sources, and that was really, really helpful for me. That when she
there's a way I sometimes do workshops with folks in churches where I talk about what's your news diet, right? And what I mean by that is, are you just like you have a diverse diet with the food that you're eating, you should have a diverse diet of news, and that doesn't just mean conservative TV and liberal TV. It means reading magazines that are long-form journalism, because you get a very different context there. It means reading the Lutheran Metro, or reading the National Catholic Reporter, reading The Guardian. It means listening to some radio, and maybe listening to Canadian broadcasting, not just NPR, or listening to AM 100, or not, the point is, the more diversity that you can build into your stream, if you will, of input, the richer the meaning you're going to make. But you can't, it's not about, it's not even about trying to, you're not the scientist that has to come up with the solution to this. It's about how do you enrich the stories that are in your purview? How are you listening? And as a pastoral leader in a particular setting, then you get, you all, right? You have this rich, deep database of the biblical stories and theological understandings that most people have very little knowledge of, let alone access to. But lots of people have stories of their lives, and so how do you help build connections between those databases, right? How do you create some exchanges across those containers? Everything, and I think Martin Luther was really doing that a lot. He was really thinking about, okay, it's not just this, it's like, we're gonna let everybody read the Bible. We're not just gonna let priests read it, we're gonna let everybody read it. Anyway.
And with that, we are pretty much out of time because Craig has some closing announcements. So can we give them a round of applause, please?